Good morning. We'll be starting up in a couple of minutes. As you're logging in, go ahead and open up your chat pod, your Q&A pod down the bottom part of the screen and get ready to take polls using either pollev.com/DavidRP or you can download the app if you prefer. Um, if you open up the chat pod, that's a one-way communication. That's where we'll send you links to the polls. You don't have to type everything in and to the handout for today. And we'll repeat that again for those who come in a little later. And the Q&A is where we are going to take input, and we'll probably ask you to raise your hand a few times as well. Okay, we'll give folks about 30 seconds to finish logging in, and then we'll go ahead and get started for our last of our roadway safety series that we're doing. Okay. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome. My name is David Orr. I am the director here with the Cornell Local Roads Program. We're your New York State LTAP Center. And this is the last in a series of 4 webinars we're doing on roadway safety, and we're going to be talking about improvements of curves today. Um, just to get us all started on the same page, a lot of this material comes from the Federal Highway Administration's Proven Safety Countermeasures, the New York State Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, and our manual on safer roads and streets. Now, this is again one of 4 webinars that we've been doing on road safety. We've been doing a few others. As we get started, make sure you've opened up your chat pod and your Q&A pod. The Q&A is where you're going to be able to put in information and ask questions. The chat, we're going to send you links via that chat pod. We'll give you another 15 seconds to get that open. And then Amanda or Jody in the background is going to send you the links so you don't have to type in the address for the polls and or the handout. If you can't access the handout, please make sure you put something in the Q&A. We can get it emailed over to you. Just so you know, this is worth 1 professional development hour for those who are engineers and need it for continuing education credit. So let's start with our welcome. Uh, I suspect I know the answers because a lot of you have been coming into all of the others, but let's go ahead and go through. So who do you work for? Town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, an MPO, consultant, contractor, or you're working for the weekend. And we have some people who are working for the weekend. That's always fun. Okay. If you can't access the polls, please feel free to put it into the Q&A, and I can add that to the thinking that we've got. So we have somebody who is with a town, we have somebody who's with a county, just as an example. Okay, cool. Got a good variety today. Okay. What is your job? Are you an administrator, highway superintendent, engineer, planner, field crew, supervisor? Are you an elected board member? Or are you none of the above? If you put none of the above down, I don't see any yet, put it in the Q&A, but let's see what else we got. And then, yep, we can put the poll link into the chat. We'll magically do that again for those who opened up their chat pod a little bit late. A lot of engineers today. Okay, well, good. If you can pick up one thing and take it home and use it, I've had a great day. So that's my goal. And then where are you from? In this case, you get to click on the map and see where you're from. We've had good variety in this. This is always fun to see the population. So we have folks up in the North Country. We have our friends back in the boat, back in the middle of Lake Ontario. As I say, I've always wondered about the Wi-Fi out there, but hey, there you go. Wi-Fi in the lake. Hopefully that's true. But okay, so really good variety. It's good to see. Um, and so we've also had some folks tell us a few other places downstate. That's good to know in the Catskills. Now, we've been talking about roadway safety because the number of fatalities went way up after COVID. It jumped by over 10,000 people per year who were killed. And we're really trying to bring that number back down. And FHWA has asked for a focus on 3 crash focus areas, which we've talked about: roadway departures, intersections, bicycles, and pedestrians. And the reason roadway departures is the primary emphasis right now, and yes, eventually the state's going to also have some intersection bicycle pedestrian plans, but starting with roadway departures because over half of all fatalities and the serious injuries that occur are either primarily or secondarily due to a roadway departure. Sometimes people think of those as a lane departure. So the roadway departure safety action plan is where there's some money that's going to be coming available. I will tell you right now, there's a link in the handout. Make sure you download not only the plan but the appendices. There's some really good stuff in the appendices about proven countermeasures and about some risk factors that you can use either in your existing or if you're developing a local road safety plan. And the concept of roadway departure safety comes back to three things: keep the vehicle on the road or in their lane, reduce the potential for a crash if they do leave the lane, and then minimize the severity of the crash if they do happen to hit something. Okay, so that's the concept here. And what we spoke about was why this is an important issue. We spent an hour together talking about local road safety plans, and we went through as many of the FHWA's proven safety countermeasures as we could in an hour. There's a lot more out there than we could cover, and we even did talk about some of the intersection, cross-cutting, and pedestrian bicycle issues as well. But I would say go to that website if you're interested in any of the proven safety countermeasures. Now, we've asked this question before, but again, will help me a little bit, especially as we're talking about curves. Which of the following proven countermeasures has your agency used? Curve delineation, improving the clear zone, pavement marking, safety edge, rumble strips, crosswalk improvements, roundabouts, or better signals? And that's a whole variety of things with better signals, from rapid flashing beacons to hawk lights. Let's see what you guys have used. Okay. So most of you have used pavement markings. A lot of you have looked at your clear zones and curve delineation. That's good to see. Okay, so good variety of things. Okay, cool. So let's get started and talk about curves. And the two parts of the curves we're going to look at the delineation of horizontal curves, okay, signs and stripes and things like that. And then we're going to look at some roadside design improvements at curves to make them better for flow and better for safety. And the reality is both of these are not only proven countermeasures, but they go hand in hand in a lot of ways. And the reason we wanted to have a special webinar on them is because there's just a lot of little things to think about. Now, why do we care about curves so much? Well, if you look at the roadway departure crashes, the portion of them that are at curves is pretty high. Rollover crashes, 44% of the time, they're occurring in or around a curve. Head-on crashes, people cutting the corner, 30% of the time occur at a curve. Trees, 45% of the crashes occur where someone goes off the road in a curve and they hit a tree. So this is why we're focusing on that. Another way to look at this, if you're interested, is to look at some data the state did on the state system at curve radii, and we've talked about this before, that sharper curves, sharper corners if you prefer, have a higher crash rate than we would expect based upon the number of segments. So that's a place where we want to emphasize and spend our money to get improvement. So curves is where it's at in terms of improving safety. We could get all the curves safer, we'd go a long ways to reducing our roadway departure crash problem. So let's start with seeing if you see any problems with this photograph. We'll come back and talk about some solutions after we review what you might do here. But let me ask you first, serious poll today. I'm going to let you put your answers in, and we're not going to share them, but I'll go back to the picture. What problems do you see here? You can go ahead and put that into the poll. And again, if you can't access the poll, you're welcome to put it into the Q&A. What kind of problems do you see at this site that maybe we could make better? Let's see what you'll come up with. Okay, I'll come over here and I'll click on responses and see what you've come up with. Oh, all kinds of fun stuff here. Yeah, there's a wrong curve. It's pointing in the wrong direction. There's no delineators. There's limited sight distance. There's some utility poles in the way. Yeah, the lines are faded. There's only a line on one side. Yeah, it's all kinds of things to think about. It's confusing. Yeah. So there's all kinds of things to think about. We'll go back and look at that picture. Yeah, there's just a whole slew of things, and I bet there's a few you didn't put. Let me see. Did you get them all? No, there's still a few others here. You got the big ones, but there's actually some other things too. And there's some issues about shoulders and utilities and stuff like that. So we'll come back to this one. But let's talk about the kind of things you want to think about on every single curve that you've got. And we're going to start with delineation, which is essentially says signs, markings, and delineators. Okay? Now, obviously, we know we want to see going around the corner. We know it helps, but way too often we see things like this. Um, yeah, I think we have a problem here. Uh, we've got a curve pointing in the wrong direction. We're mixing a regulatory sign with a warning sign. There's no markings. There's a whole slew of things that we could improve on here. So these are some pretty obvious ones. That's a really low-hanging fruit item. But one of the questions uh, that I'm wondering about is really important. Why do we put up signs? This is something that people, they think, well, the signs are put up to tell us the safe speed to go around the corner. Actually, they're not. That sounds crazy, but they're not actually there to tell you the safe speed to go around the corner. They're there to provide uniform information to the driver. The model that's used for sign placement is based actually on driver comfort, and it's a consistency factor. In fact, it comes in the name of the sign manual. It's the manual on uniform traffic control devices, and we're providing uniform information to the driver. Because you all know that on a nice, warm summer day with good tires and a good car, you can go around that corner faster than the sign says, the yellow sign. But the goal is, if we do our job right, we're providing consistent information. So if we see a sign that says 20 for a sharp corner and the speed limit is 55, that should have the same feel, whether it's a county road or a state road, whether you're in Missouri or New York. The idea is uniformity, and it helps us understand that, hey, on a wet day, we probably do need to go close to that speed. And if it's icy, if we do actually get some snow today and tomorrow, you probably got to go even slower than that. We're not going to have variable speeds. We're giving people uniform basic information. And of course, here in New York State, right now, the official manual of uniform traffic control devices is the 11th edition at the national level, and the old New York State supplement. New York State is working on a new supplement, but right now you need to use the old supplement with the new national manual. If there's a conflict, go with the national. If you're not sure, ask. Ask us, ask the state DOT. Don't assume it's not worth it. Okay? There is at first it looks like a significant change, but there's really just a change in how they wrote things up for the delineation around horizontal curves. And what they've done is they've created a table to get us started. And the idea is you look at the roadway type. And so you have freeways, you have arterials and collectors with and without markings, and you have local roads. And the idea is you look at the road type and you look at the traffic volume, the daily traffic, ranging from less than 1, less than 3, less than 4, or more than 4,000 vehicles a day, and you decide what you need for delineation. And what the table essentially says in text, but I'm going to show it to you with little dots, is if you're on a freeway, every single horizontal curve needs to be delineated in one form or another. Okay? Not as hard as you think. We'll come back to why in a minute. It just has to have some kind of delineation. Okay? If it's an arterial collector that does not have pavement markings, if you get more than 3,000 vehicles a day, more than 3,000, you shall do something. Okay? And in that case means obviously some kind of signs or delineation. If it's over 1,000 and less than 3,000, then you should have markings, and it's a good idea. It's optional below 1,000 vehicles a day, but it might be something to do on all of your curves because not everybody knows what the traffic volume is. If you have markings, there's a slight change where you don't have to essentially have additional signs. The markings are going to be enough. Um, but you should still think about doing it if the traffic volumes are a little bit high. And above 4,000, you're putting them up. And then one of the things they did, which I will personally tell you, this is my own personal opinion, they say that it's optional for local roads. I personally would like to see us think about putting up good delineation on any curve if the traffic volume gets high enough. okay? And think about not just the traffic volume, but how sharp that corner is. But it is technically just considered an optional or may if you do the old shall, should, may concept, okay? Now, if you're not sure if you have arterial collector according to the federal classifications, you can actually go online, just search New York State Functional Classification Viewer, and up will pop a map. This happens to be parts of Lewis County, where you can actually find out whether your road is considered to be either local, collector, arterial, and you can use the table that way. Now, remember, I said just required whether you have to have or not have some kind of delineation. What does that mean? What do we have to place for curb signs? Okay? What are the required traffic control devices? What you do is you go out and you calculate the speed differential between what people are driving or the speed limit. One of the two is the consistency issue, and what you can go around that corner using different techniques, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So you do that, and if the speed differential is 5 miles an hour or 0, that lowest range, there is definitely a difference. You have to have either pavement markings or an advanced sign, which is why in the interstate system, it's actually not that hard to delineate every curve because the interstate system always has stripes. So as long as you've got markings, you technically can be done. You don't need to have any more. But obviously not every road can have markings on it. So again, something to think about. And if you're losing the markings due to winter maintenance activities, you might want to think about putting up that advanced sign. If the speed differential is 10 miles an hour, so it's in the 5 to 10 range, it's higher than 5, it's 10 miles an hour, you need to have an advanced sign, okay? If it's 15, you need to have an advanced sign and some delineators going around the corner. But if it's really hard to get the delineators in, you could put up one of those big arrow signs. And if it's 20 miles an hour or more, don't just use delineators, go all the way up to chevrons. And again, you can always use a supplemental sign with the big arrow. And if we had a whole day, we could talk about the details of exactly where to place all of these things, but we'll give you some things today that might help you out in terms of spacing. Now, let's talk a little bit about that pavement marking issue. If you've got a low change of speed, all you need is pavement markings, okay? If you got a road that's people are driving 55 miles an hour and you're only deflecting them a little bit, the markings are really all that you need. We know we've talked about this as a proven safety countermeasure, and we know it can really help, okay? But that's for low speed changes, okay, on our system. That we know there's a visual value for lines, even on a straightaway. It makes a big difference if you put the lines down. According to the MUTCD, you only need to have one type of stripe to meet the requirement, okay? But again, you want to have a policy in place on what markings you're going to have. You can technically have now just edge lines if the road is narrow enough, though we know that center lines do a really much better job of keeping vehicles apart, head-ons and things like that. But you're going to look at your traffic volume, you're going to look at your speeds, those kind of things. Now, obviously, we can't put traffic lines on a gravel road. So on a gravel road, we're going to have to sign things. And yes, there are some gravel roads I know that are over 1,000 vehicles a day. Yes, they're probably local roads, but you may want to think about signing, again, all of your curves, especially the sharp ones. Okay? So how do we do this? Well, one of the most common methods, in fact, the most common method, is to use a ball bank indicator. So let me just ask, before we talk about how to use this, do you know how to use a ball bank? Yes, no, or you can just say, what the heck is a ball bank indicator? Most of you know how to use a ball bank. Well, okay. About half of you know how to use a ball bank indicator. Some of you don't know what a ball bank indicator is. Some of you say no. And again, we can only get in little bit details, but the idea behind a ball bank indicator is you've got this little bitty black bubble, piece of plastic actually, inside of a vial of water that's arced, as you see here. This thing was designed initially to be put on a grater, so as the grater blade turns, it would actually move with the grater blade, and you can get the pitch, the angle. And the idea is they figured out, we could also use it as a dynamic device, and you can see the ball go up as you go around a sharp corner. And you run back and forth on the roadway to determine the safe speed on the curves. There are more ways to do the safe speed on a curve than just using a ball bank. There's something called the compass method, where you go out and you check the change of angle, essentially. Okay? You can use a safety-based method, which has to do with looking at traffic crashes and accidents and something about the shape of the roadway. You could use an accelerometer. There are devices out there that replace the ball bank with an electronic version of it using an accelerometer. Design speed equations based upon the super elevation on the road and the radius, and of course the ball bank. But they all really come back to that same concept. And with the ball bank, if it's really a slow curve, you're allowed a little bit more deflection because you're not going that fast. I will tell you right now, I'm a big fan of the ones that measure the road directly, the ball bank or the accelerometer based methods. And why? Well, let's show a little video of how a ball bank works going around a corner. And we're going to watch our friend Nick Kuzmic, who works in our lab downstairs and gets to do fun little special projects, as he drives around the corner. Watch the little black ball as he goes around the corner. And you can see, as he comes around the corner, the ball comes up, and right at the very end, all of a sudden, it swings outside the black. It's to the point where we would need to sign that curve. And that's what happens on a lot of our road system. The road looks nice and smooth, but there's a little dip as you come out of the curve, or there's a place where the maintenance hasn't been done right, or it's got a pothole, and that's going to throw that little black ball off just a little bit. If you just use the design speed or a compass-based method, you may miss those little dips and dives. So I'm a big fan of using something where you're measuring directly in the field. And if you've got a car with cruise control and two people, and that's actually important, two people with a cruise control device, vehicle, give you better results. This was just a video to show how things work, but if you really want to do it right, you really want two people to get consistency. That's actually probably the biggest issue with using the ball bank, is the consistency. And it's really hard to watch the ball bank and drive and record. So we're big fans of using two people for this. Okay? Now, what signs do we put up? Well, that depends upon the advisory speed. There is a change in the new MUTCD. Now, will the state change it with their supplement? Don't know for sure, but here's the change. The speed, if it's over 35 miles an hour, greater than or equal to 35 miles an hour, you put up the shallower curve sign, okay? The slight curve or the S curve sign. If it's 30 miles an hour or less, you may put up the sharper corner sign. That used to be you shall. Okay, now it's a should/may, depending upon how much differential speed you've got. And they did that, I think, in part because some corners that technically are at 30 miles an hour or less, because the approach speeds were pretty small, relative difference wasn't great, it didn't drive the same way as a sharp corner. And remember, we're trying to be uniform in what we tell people. I suspect this is going to get tweaked over time, but just something to be aware of. Think about a driver. Think about somebody who's not familiar with how we develop all of this. What's going to help them get around that corner as safe as possible? And of course, if you have more than 3 curves, use the winding curve sign, but you could always supplement it with an additional sign for one that's sharp within a series. And then we're going to put an advisory plaque underneath as needed. Okay? Now, you want to think about putting up delineators and chevrons. Here's the situation. We're out doing a field visit, and you can see these chevrons are really doing a nice job, along with the traffic lines, helping us see around the corner on a really foggy day. Now, what's the spacing? 2 things come in mind. One is there is a standard, and I'll show you the table here in the next slide. But think about the fact that you always want to see at least 3 delineators/chevrons at all times, at least 3. And in this case, you can actually see 4. It really helps define the curve. We are much better off if we can see that, okay? So, chevron spacing comes from table in the new MUTCD 2C-5. My biggest concern with table 2C-5 is people see this as one table that has all these three readings that work together. And really, we should really think about it as one table that tells us the sign spacing if we know the advisory speed, and another table that tells us the sign spacing if we know the curve radius. Okay? And you can't use the sign spacing to give you either the curve radius or the advisory speed, especially the advisory speed. You really get the advisory speed using a ball bank or an accelerometer or a Riker device or using one of those other safety-based methods, and or you get the curve radius by going out and measuring it. And then that gives you the starting point for the sign spacing, whether it's 40, 80, 120 or so feet. And then when you're out there, you're going to have to tweak it a little bit for the real world situation where, again, you want to see at least three signs as you're driving around the corner. Okay? So let's go look at an example of how I can get a curve radius. Pretty simply, I can actually use our friend Google. Go online, download an overhead picture, and if it's a nice right angle like this one, that's actually pretty easy. I just find the intersection point, I draw myself a circle, I then sort of can, move it around. I can throw it in PowerPoint or some other tool, something online like Notability or whatever you want. I move my circle over. I now have my radius, okay? And I can come in here, the bottom right of the map, it gives me a scale, and using that, I can get the radius of the curve, okay? So pretty easy to do. So if the radius is 380 feet, what would be the sign spacing? So again, I'm going to go here. I'm even going to be nice to you. I'm going to pop this back to the table so you can see the table. 380 foot spacing, or radius, excuse me, 380 foot radius. What's my starting point for the sign spacing? Okay, 380 foot radius. Okay, so let's go see what y'all came up with for an answer. 80 feet, very good. Yes, 80 feet. Okay, so if we go back and look at our tables, we'll blow it up. 380 feet falls into the radius range of 200 to 400, so it's in the 80-foot range. But obviously, we're towards the edge of that range, so we might want to go a little bit higher than 80 feet. Okay, if we were down closer to 220, 250 feet, we might want to go tighter with our spacing. That's a starting point. And one of the best ways to do this is get yourself a bunch of cones, traffic cones, and lay them out with a wheel at where you think the sign spacing is going to go, and then drive the corner and get a sense of, hey, this works or doesn't work. And then put your signs up. So cones are cheap. You can put a whole bunch of cones and check to see if they're going to do what you want them to do. So if we look at our sign spacing, okay, let's assume that in this particular case, remember, we said that the sign spacing is 80 feet. They did actually do a curve study on the one you're looking at, and the advisory speed was 25 miles an hour, which, by the way, if you do two different measurements and get the same ultimate answer of 80-foot sign spacing, that's a good sign. It does tell you your road's pretty consistent. Okay, so if it's a 25 mile an hour curve on a 55 mile an hour road, has got a lowered speed limit, we're going to be putting up advanced signs and chevrons because we've got more than a 20 mile an hour differential speed. Now, if people were going slower, even if the speed limit were 55, but they're actually only going about 45, you might be able to have less required traffic control devices using an 85th percentile approach. But remember, people might be going faster as well. And so consistency matters. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. How many of you use the policy of setting all of your advanced signs and distances using 55 miles an hour or whatever the speed limit is? Raise your hand if that's your policy. I'm going to ask you in a second to go the other way and use 85th percentile. But how many of you use speed limit to set your advanced sign spacing and what your speed differential would be? Okay? And again, it's a consistency issue. So, going to lower your hands here and ask you how many of you use 85th percentile in your calculations? Okay? And then finally, there is the magic middle. How many of you actually use a modified approach where most of the time you use the speed limit, but some places you've actually used 85th percentile, a slightly different approach? The biggest challenge there is being consistent. Do you have a policy or do you have at least a thought process of when we're going to switch? You know, if we've got 85th percentile information that says the difference speed is more than, say, 10 miles an hour, probably okay. But think about that. Think about what would happen if you wound up in court. Now, here's a question here. If my only choice is 80 or 100-foot spacing, or can I interpolate? Well, of course you can interpolate. That's a starting point. Remember, it's a standard. The sign spacing for the delineation is really just a starting point because you're going to have to modify things. As a perfect example, let's look back at our curve. So I plopped on here on the thing somewhere the chevrons would need to be. Okay? But because there's an intersection, okay, and we can talk long and hard about whether or not that should still be there as an intersection, but you can't really put the delineators at the exact spacing because you need to have access for the vehicles to get on and off where they're coming off the town road there. So you're going to have to modify things. That's the real world. That's why I'm saying when you go back to look, make sure you think about being able to see at least three of those delineators slash chevrons at any given time. And that's really going to help you out. The other thing to make sure of is make sure your chevrons or delineators go all the way around the curve. Way too often I'll see as I'm driving around, the chevrons stop short. And so they don't take you all the way to the back to the point of tangent, to the end of the curve. And again, you want to give drivers good information where the end of the curve is. And by the way, you can use Google even on a curve that's not 90 degrees. Draw yourself a couple of lines at 90 degrees from the tangent sections where those intersect. Draw yourself a circle. And now you can do the same calculations with the radius and using that distance at the bottom right. And that'll get you in the same ballpark. Okay? In this case, by the way, it turns out to have the same radius of about 380 feet. Okay? So it's still an 80-foot spacing. And so then you would come in and you would lay things out. In a perfect world, this particular corner should have 7 delineators to get all the way around the corner. But because there's intersection, you have to modify things slightly, dealing with the fact that there's other vehicles involved. But again, as you drive around it, look to make sure people can see 3. So we've now put up our signs, we've talked about our markings. Let's now spend some time looking at some roadside design improvements, things we can do at corners to improve the curves themselves. Now, this is supposedly the curviest road in the United States, even curvier than Lombard Street, according to Ripley's Believe It or Not. It's in Iowa. Whether it is or not, I don't know. I've been at both streets. I've walked both streets. They're both curvy. We'll just say that. This was done specifically so you could get horses down off of a steep bluff down to the level of the Mississippi River, and it made it easier than having a straight shot. But let's talk about roadway improvements at corner curves. We know this is a proven countermeasure. There's a whole bunch of little things you can do, and some of the little things you can do are in of themselves proven safety countermeasures. One of the biggest issues is dealing with edge drop-offs, and curves are especially a problem because vehicles don't track in a nice, even path. They track inside a little bit. They get wider, especially if there's a trailer behind them, okay? And they tend to create ruts going around the corner, and we see this all the time, okay? So keep that in mind, and it's something we can think about dealing with that. So one thing you could do is if you have an edge drop-off, is you could use the proven safety countermeasure of a safety edge. And we did talk about this last week with the proven countermeasures, but it's one of my favorites. It's one I'd like to see more people using. So I'm just going to remind you of what's going on. I'm going to get rid of the sound so you don't have to listen to them talking. But watch carefully when this vehicle gets off the road and he tries to pull himself back up. He has to turn the wheel so hard that he loses control. Okay, so we know that edge drop-off is a major problem, and that's why the safety edge was developed. It sits inside the paver, and it puts the edge of the pavement at a 30 to 35 degree angle, and that does 2 things. It improves the durability of the roadway, but it also makes it a lot safer until you can get in and put in the shoulders, or if it does get washed out by traffic or rubbed out, it's at least safe for a short period until you can get back there and do a more permanent fix. So let me just ask by raise of hands, how many of you are using Safety Edge? Even some. I'm not saying policy on every single road, but how many of you have used it or are, continuing to use it? That's good. Okay. It is actually in the state standard. So if you're with the state, you probably should be raising your hand, though I don't see it everywhere. It's something we should be probably thinking about doing because it actually does both improve the durability and improve safety. Okay. Now let's talk about one that I don't see as much as we should see, and that is just widening curves. So you just widen the lanes a little bit. I'm not talking about improving shoulders. Yes, we could spend some time talking about improving shoulders, and that is a proven safety countermeasure. I'm talking about widening the lanes on sharper curves. It's cheaper than widening the entire road. But let me ask you this. Widening curves. You can select all of these. Is it a good way to improve safety? It is a part of the AASHTO Green Book. It's not commonly done, not something you do currently, or none of the above. And if you click on none of the above, make sure you put in the Q&A what you are describing. I'll give you about 15 seconds to put in your answers. You can select all that apply, and then we'll see what your results are. So you don't see everybody else's. Okay. Let's see what we have. Some people, by the way, are putting into the Q&A. They're putting in things like good way to improve safety, not commonly done, part of the AASHTO Green Book. Okay. Yeah, we know it's a good way to improve safety. And a lot of you that voted, okay, voted for that. It is actually part of the AASHTO Green Book. It is actually in the standard, and yet we don't see it. It is not commonly done, and most agencies aren't doing it currently, okay? So it is something we should be thinking about, and it would help eliminate some of that edge drop-off. Now, the idea behind widening the curves is you actually increase the pavement width, typically on the inside, okay? And you essentially transition to the full extra width at about the same time you have full super elevation. So it's the same concept, okay? So it's something you may want to think about. Now let's see here. Is there a process to help with this? Roads are tight. You're not going to put it on every single road. I want to talk about that a little bit, okay? But again, you're not widening it a lot, but you're widening it some, okay? But it's really something to think about for your problem curves, that concept of systemic safety that we talked about, that risk-based approach. You could start there. So as an example, let's take a 20-foot wide roadway, okay? That's the traveled way portion, not the shoulder, okay? For a 20-foot wide roadway, if you had a pretty narrow radius of 300 feet, and that's a really tight radius, I know that, but even at 30 miles an hour, you really should be actually wider because of the way people track. The standard actually is 3 to 3.5 feet for a really sharp corner like that. Okay? Now, it's not as much on other corners, but it does depend on the approach speed. And if the approach speeds are low enough for a fairly wide radius, you might not have to widen it at all. Now, you're probably going, well, I got to go out and survey all my radii. Yes, you could. You could go out and you could do that same field check I talked about in Google. That would work. That's a fine way to do it. I got another trick for you. This is actually a pretty cool old school trick, but it works pretty well. Go out there and take a 62-foot cord. Okay? In other words, take one of those old 100-foot tapes that you've got and lay out a straight line, 62 feet long. Okay? You draw that line on the pavement. Inside of the white line is pretty good. You could do the center line, but then you have to deal with traffic issues a little bit more. Then measure what's called the ordinate, the offset from the curve, the white line, or the edge line, or the center line, or the joint line if you only have a joint. And that distance is what's known as the degree of curve. And we all learned that in highway engineering, and we all completely forgot about it. That's where it comes from. It comes from old railroad engineering stuff, and allowed them to figure out how much offset they'd have to be, how they would do their rails in a particular situation, because rails, of course, were still straight, or they had to bend them a little bit. So how do you do this? Well, we walked up and we took a road on campus and we measured the ordinate and got the inside. It took us longer to walk to the site than to measure it. We just took a This case, we didn't have a steel tape, though a steel tape might have been better, but it wouldn't have shown up on picture as well. We just grabbed the tape, made it nice and straight. Then we went and found the largest distance. In this case, it was about 6 inches from the inside of the edge line to our tape. And then we can do a quick check. And there's a formula for that. It's in our safety workshop manual if you're interested. But essentially, the distance you measure is the degree of curvature, which is related to the radius. For 6 inches, it would be about a 950-foot radius. And when I did it using the Google method, I got a value of about 980 feet. So very similar numbers. And in that particular case, the widening would be somewhere between 2 and 2.5 feet, depending on the approach speeds. In fact, on campus, the speeds are low enough, it wouldn't kick in. Okay? It wouldn't kick in to widen it, make it worth it, because it's not worth it if it's pretty narrow, until you get to, I think it's 40 or 45 miles an hour. Okay? Now, if you had a pretty flat, pretty sharp curve, yeah, you didn't even need it on a low volume road, like a 16-degree curve. You might want to think about that. So in your urban areas, that's part of the reason we have to cut the corner. We have to think about how trucks and vehicles actually travel. So you may want to think about widening your curves out. And part of the reason we've forgotten about that old thing was, well, let's face it, if you're on an interstate or arterial, the radii are pretty large. The degree of curvatures are in the 1 to 2 range. They're pretty flat. You don't really need to widen the road. And all because you've already got a pretty wide lane as well, 14 foot on the interstate. So something you might want to think about. And again, I do understand the right-of-way issue. I'm very sympathetic with that, especially on our roads by use. But again, if we're systematic or systemic, pick your favorite, we can approach this problem one at a time. And of course, super elevation is a big issue. And we could spend, if we had a whole day, we could spend a good bit of time talking about super elevation and how much super you need to given on the speed. It helps us by essentially helping us with the friction values on the roadway, and we can get around the corner faster. So we've got a good super elevation on this roadway here. Makes it safer for a lot of reasons, but we can't go too steep because of snow and ice control, and we do have to worry about the overbreak at the shoulder. The bigger issue I worry about with super elevation isn't a road like this. It's a road like this, like we saw just before. Because let's say you wanted to put a nice consistent super elevation all the way around that corner. Really good idea. However, how do you transition that to the intersecting roadway? Well, one of the other reasons we like to bring the roadways in at a nice 90-degree angle is then you can actually have a straight transition with a curve, a horizontal curve, to bring that roadway in properly and still have the nice super going all the way around the corner. Because if it's too differential, you're going to throw your ball bank off, and you're going to have issues with safety when that happens. So again, super elevation is something you may want to think about. Okay. Now I know I'm going to bring this up, and people are going to go, "Oh, he's bringing up those rumble strip things again that he talked about last week." Yeah, I'm going to bring them up again. They can be focused just on corners. If you don't want to do the entire road system, you could think about rumble strips, cards for the center line, shards for the shoulder, just in the area where there's a corner. Again, not doing the whole road, but the places where we know you're more likely to have problems, a focused approach. They're a proven safety countermeasure. I do know some of the issues with joints and edges and pavement deterioration. They all have to be thought about. And of course, there's the issue if you're in an area where there's people living, people don't like the sound. I promised you last week that I would bring it back up because I told you I would tell you about something called a mumble strip. Okay? So a mumble strip, instead of grooving just the little ridges, they make a sinusoidal shape to it. Okay? It doesn't have as much noise outside, but there's still quite a bit of vibration. They're still researching it. I will be completely honest with you, but it's a possibility, something to think about. And as the research gets better and better, it may be something to look at. Caltrans in California and MnDOT in Minnesota have looked at these, and they feel like they work pretty well. And maybe if you can't put a full rumble strip in because of political pressure, put in what you can and look at a substantive improvement. Okay. Now, the other thing we need to know and think about is clear zones. In fact, the proven safety countermeasure is actually for removing fixed objects. They don't focus on curves, they're focused on other activities. But thinking about removing fixed objects, consistency matters. That to me is probably the biggest issue, the thing we want to think about. Here's a classic picture. This was taken by Jeff Scott as he was driving around. And that tree, that single tree doesn't look too bad, and that curve looks pretty flat. But that tree's been hit several times. Imagine now coming the other direction, you're a driver, and if you just wander off just a little bit, if that edge drops off just a little bit too much, that tree is in a really bad location. Looks like a really safe location, but again, we want consistency with our clear zone. And if we trim things properly, get rid of the brush and the debris, boy, we can really improve the sight distance. Now, I know we're outside the right of way, not always possible, but always be trying to think about what you can do with what you have, where you are to improve things. And by the way, we could spend a whole 20 minutes talking about the rail system for that bridge, but again, that's a different webinar. So, gonna have you a couple more possible things to add to your bag of tricks. Um, Here's the situation. What is the proper sign here, by the way? I'm standing right beside the intersection sign. This is a sign with an intersection sign and then a curve sign. Okay? So if I'm going to pick a sign, what sign is the proper sign? And watch this. You're going to get to click and tell me what is the proper sign here. Okay? Some of you have already started doing it. What's the proper sign here? Okay? Everybody's voting for the middle one. Very few of you have voted for the left. A few of you have voted for the right. And the correct answer is it's the main road. That's the driver. So technically, it's the one on the right because that's the main road. It's going straight, and the other road is going off to the side. It is confusing as all get out to the public, and the actual sign that used to be there was a Y intersection because it was confusing for everybody. So one of my favorite signs, and it's something if you aren't using them, I would put it in your bag of tricks, is the combined curve and intersection sign, the W1-10 series. You can't use this if there's more than two intersecting roads around your curve, but boy, can it make a big difference and improve safety. The little black lines are slightly narrower, and they should have the same angle as the road at the actual site, okay? So if we look at a situation, that particular site, we could put one sign up that has the combination curve straight road, and it's much easier for the public to understand what they're seeing. And if we add up all of our signs, we have our chevrons going around the corner, we have a double arrow at the end of the stop, we have a stop ahead, much better for the public to understand what they're seeing. Now I'm going to lower everybody's hands. I'm going to ask you, how many of you have used the combination sign? Just how many of you have used the combo sign? I'm just curious. Okay, cool. Good to see. Again, one you might want to think about. Another thing is we go back to our concept of the chevrons, okay? Um, you might want to orient your chevrons slash your delineators to the traffic approach. If you just put two right next to each other, one of the signs might work. The other sign isn't going to be angled very well. You could double post. You could put two posts up, the two different angles, because they really should be angled for traffic. But now you're putting more things that be struck. So alternatively, you can put frames up and people going, well, where have I seen that? Well, I've seen some. Here's one in Jamestown, New York. Okay? Where you actually help the drivers because now the signs are oriented properly to their lights and they can see them better. Okay? So things to keep in mind. The other thing is you want to make sure you have a good maintenance program. And there are three parts to a good maintenance program. You want to have maintenance to make sure the signs are clean. That's pretty important. A maintenance program to replace signs that are no longer retroreflective. And we could do a whole webinar on retroreflectivity. And even if you've got good signs, If the signs are oriented improperly, doesn't matter. It's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of having the chevrons oriented in two different directions. There's four signs here. If I measure those four signs with a retroreflectometer with the hit the button, they would meet the standard. All four signs are bright enough, but only three of those signs are really helping the driver. That one sign doesn't pick up until you're almost to it. It's so far out of orientation. So again, think about your sign maintenance and really should be doing nighttime inspections of your signs to check to see how they're doing. And you can also get a sense of if there's vegetation and stuff like that in the way. So how many of you do nighttime inspections? Raise your hand if you do nighttime inspections. Okay, good. Even if you're doing daytime inspections, you can do these things. You may want to think about doing those in the day, in the summer when the vegetation has grown up, but make sure you've got a good sign maintenance program. Signs are in more lawsuits than any other thing we do, and we really want to make sure we have them done well. Now, in our last 10 minutes together, we're going to do some case studies. Let's take all the things we've talked about, and let's figure out what we might do in a few situations, okay? So let's start with the one we talked about before. We already saw the problems, okay? We saw the sign was in the wrong direction. We saw the markings were in the wrong place. But what possible upgrades could you put here? Okay, and I'll even go ahead and just let you see. And I'm going to go back to the picture so you can see it. Okay, and I'll see the pictures. You can see the picture. Start putting your answers in and see what y'all come up with. Okay. And then let's go back and see what y'all got for results. Okay, safety edge, better signs, improve the markings, maybe think about rumble strips. Okay, that's a possibility. Okay, okay, possibly a wider on the inside of the corner. Okay, good. Delineators of some type. Okay, adding in stripes. When we develop local road safety plans, we're developing essentially like an asset management plan for safety. And we're doing it at the network level. And so at a network level, we're going to come up with generalities. When you actually go to do the project, you're going to go out and you're going to do a project level management system. And you're going to figure out for a particular site what kind of things you might see. And y'all have done a nice job. You've really made a nice list of the kind of things to think about. So when we looked at this particular site, the minimum would be to put up the proper signs and the proper delineation. That's the minimum starting point. Some of you caught it, but again, when you walk a site and you start looking at it carefully, you'll see things like an edge drop off where people were cutting the corner and they were going to have problems. So that's why some of you mentioned the safety edge or a mumble strip, or widen that out a little bit and make it slightly wider on the inside and then restripe it when you're done. And you've improved safety for almost everybody. Okay? And again, you can even change the chevron height a little bit, by the way, to help people around the corner. There's, again, remember, standards are minimums. Okay, let's do another one. There is no other advanced sign than the one you see that is right before we get to the corner. There are no other signs. So I'm going to come in here. Give me a sec. I'm going to clear the results. Hang on. There we go. Now, go ahead and start putting in your answers. And we'll go back and show you the pictures so you can put in your answers while we're waiting for you to give answers. And again, if you can't access, you can throw it into the Q&A. See what kind of possible upgrades that you might do here. Okay. Okay, so let's see what y'all came up with. Gave y'all a second here. Let's see what our nice little Wordle pops up. Maybe clear some trees and brush. Maybe some widening. You got to worry about some poles. Okay. Definitely thinking about some chevrons / delineators. Whether you need that or not depends on the speed differential. Okay. Think about the super elevation. Hard to see in a photograph if the super is any good, but again, good things to think about. So let's go back and look at the picture, and let's talk about a couple of things here that come to mind almost immediately if you look at them. Number one, you'll notice that sign is a sharp turn sign. If somebody felt there was a sharp turn sign, almost assuredly you need a plaque under there. You definitely want that advanced speed plaque, and it's got to be further away from the corner. Now you'll know in the old MUTCD there was a sign that was placed that actually you put the number inside the sign. That was supposed to be a supplemental, an additional sign. It has been dropped from the MUTCD because it was, I hate to say it, it was misused. It wasn't used properly and it led to confusion. Signs with a plaque. The public understands that a little bit better, and then you properly delineate that. The first delineator slash chevron should actually be where that curve sign is, at the beginning point of the curve. Okay? And again, they do actually have signs going the other direction. You can see the one straight in front, the back side of it. But something to think about. Do you need an edge line on this road? Would depend on traffic volume. It would depend on other factors. But y'all have some good thoughts here. I like to see it. Nice job. Okay? Let me clear these responses. And we're going to go to our next little case study. Okay, we got time for our two more that we're going to do. How about this one? What would you do here? And again, I'll activate that so you can start putting them in. What kind of possible things are you thinking about when you see this situation? Okay. Signage I've got in the Q&A and adding chevrons. Yeah. Possibly rail. Okay, let me see what y'all come up with for the Wordle. Okay. So look at the speed limit. Proper speed limits can make a huge difference. And there are times when we lower the speed limits to the geometry. It can be done. People say it can't be done. It actually can be done, but it's maybe not as easy as you'd like, and it is done through the state for county and town roads in the most part. But yeah, chevrons, depends on the approach speed and the volumes. You definitely want to remove those stumps. If I had to pick the one thing that when I saw this, it really struck me was on the outside of a corner, we had some tree stumps that had been left. Those are deadly fixed objects. They really should be cut almost flush, okay? They're not utility poles. And where you site the utility pole can matter. Don't let people put utility poles where they're likely to get struck. Maybe widen that curve out a little bit. Maybe put a safety edge in there. Those old rail systems with the old poles, the rail's gone. It's rusted away, but the poles are still there. Maybe we need to think about that. Guide rail could be used, but remember, guide rail of itself is a fixed object, and we could do other things before we put up guide rail. But something to think about. Very challenging site. I'll admit that. Very difficult because of the nature of the terrain that you're dealing with. But it's good to think about all of these kinds of things. Okay, let me clear this one. I'm going to clear the responses, and we're going to go to our last case study together. And we'll get you out of here right on time. Okay? Possible upgrades. What do we got here? What would you think about this particular site? Okay? Okay, let's see what y'all have come up with. Possibly chevrons. And again, depends on the speed and the traffic volume and the speed differential, whether you need chevrons or you can just put up delineators. Maybe remove the inside delineators. You can put inside delineators up, but think about it. What color should those inside delineators be? Yeah, white. By the way, what color should the outside delineators be if you put up outside delineators? What color do you think? White. Everybody puts up yellow delineators. We've all done that for a long time. But technically, delineators are supposed to match the lines. So technically, it would be a white delineator. Now, I will tell you right now, if you had yellow delineators on the outside and white on the inside, I'd rather have that than nothing. But it's something to think about. Just realize there's some standards in there. And by the way, that is a shall situation for the delineator color, just so you know. Okay? Good job. Thank you very much. And are there any other questions? I've got it open up. We got about a minute. If you have a question, we can answer any questions we can. This is the last of our series. We do have our foundational series running. You're more than welcome to see us on Tuesday, so we're taking next week off because of the Thanksgiving holiday. But if any of these things are interested, please come see us also in the spring. We are running our safety workshop around the state in several places, and the launch for our workshops will be coming up at the very beginning of December. With that, everybody have yourself a great day. Stay safe. Enjoy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you on the other side. Bye-bye.